So, I'd like to welcome you to this very quick teaching. And the teaching is called Yes, God Had a Wife. And her name was Asherah. And it is going to be, a lot of people are going to hate us after this, but I cannot continue to ignore readily available archaeological evidence. I'm not going to go into so much as proving the texts. I'm instead going to refer to my teaching from yesterday. And my teaching yesterday spoke about three major paradoxes. The first paradox is the God's finger paradox, or the dimension paradox. These are free nation paradoxes that we created to try to explain things better to our audience. So when we say the God's finger paradox, I want you to think of a finger. You see my finger like this. My finger is a three-dimensional object, meaning it has length, it has breadth or width, and it has height. And then I want you to understand that in the second dimension, there is no height. So my finger, like this, cannot exist in the second dimension because it has height. And if you were living in the second dimension, the only thing you can understand about my finger is my fingerprint. Because my fingerprint is the only thing that is two-dimensional. So if God were to show you his finger, how would you be able to understand it in relation to your dimension? Because all you can take out of it is probably just the fingerprint, because that's the only part that comes in contact with your dimension. Now, if we say God is a multi-dimensional being and we live in the third dimension, the God's finger paradox creates a pool of understanding of God in such a way that it is almost impossible to relate God to our understanding and circumstance. So that is the first problem. The second problem is the time paradox, or I like to refer to it as the John of Patmos paradox. John of Patmos wrote Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, there are many things that we don't understand because of the figure of speech that he employed. And I asked a question. I said, if you were John of Patmos, living within 100 years after the resurrection of Christ, and God showed you a revelation of a captain calling another captain, and as the captain picked up the phone, he said, "Surrender now." And the captain said, "Over my body." And the other captain replied and said, "You will hear from us." 2 minutes later, 2 fighter jets flew over their country and started dropping bombs. And I said, if you were John of Patmos, explain, especially since you've never seen a phone before. It wasn't even called a telephone because there was no name for it. You'd never seen a private jet, a fighter jet before. Neither have you ever seen a bomb. So what you would just probably describe it as is a man held a reed or a stem from the wall, and through the stem he heard a voice. The revelation is what it is, but because there's a time that you haven't gotten to yet that God already is in, you will find it almost impossible to properly explain a vision God is giving you because it's not in your time frame. And the third is the context paradox that I like to call the Joe Rogan paradox. Joe Rogan was talking about a woman who was fired from her job, and she later took the company to court and won $11 million. And Joe said she used the black discrimination card, and that is why, because the woman actually was late to work 41 times in a year. And although that sounds very logical, when the counter opinion came, and the counter opinion said, well, there were other people who are Oyimbos who were later than 40, who came to work late more than 41 times, and nothing happened to them. So the Joe Rogan paradox, or the context paradox, now talks about the person who is telling the story. From what angle is he telling it? Is this story fact checked? Is this story peer reviewed? And then you come with that paradox of, you are listening to, and the best way to explain this is, Mary Magdalene saw Christ first. And Mary Magdalene took a message from Christ that he has risen to the disciples. The disciples had not seen him. But guess what? There is no book of Mary Magdalene. So Mary Magdalene's work had to be reported through the book of John, the book of Matthew, the book of Mark. All men reporting something that they didn't witness. So the context paradox now kicks in. How do you adequately tell a story from a woman's perspective when there is no woman's book in the New Testament? There is a book of Esther in the Old Testament, but was Esther the one that wrote the book? In the New Testament, there is no book of Mary Magdalene. So Mary Magdalene had to tell her story through John or Mark or Matthew, as the case may be. And that gives us a context paradox. A lot is lost in that. So how does this apply to God having a wife? You need to understand that in a male-dominated society, having a counterpart to something or someone as big as God is going to create asymmetry and imbalance. How does a man dominate when a woman is seen as his partner or his equal? You need to understand how the Old Testament was written. And you need to understand the underlying. Let me give you an example. Adultery, for instance, in the Old Testament was not a married man sleeping. Was not in today's context. Adultery is a married person having extramarital affairs outside of their marriage. In the Old Testament, adultery was only when a married woman had an affair. A married man would not be accused of adultery as long as the woman he was committing adultery with was neither married nor engaged. So adultery, once again, was based on a woman because the woman was believed to be a man's property owned by a man. If you read Matthew chapter 15 and 16, the feeding of the 4,000 and the 5,000, the women were not counted. Up till today, we do not know how many people Yahushua fed. It could be 40,000. It could be 5,000. It could be 1,000. I'll give you the example of my family. I live with 4 of my children, Amara, Abiba, Daniela, Baby Freeze, and Taste Buds and I. So we're a family of 6, right? If my family of 6 went to hear Yahushua preach, I would be the only person. I would be the only person that was counted. Because only the men were counted. Baby Free is a child, so he's not going to be counted. And all the other ladies that went with me, although all of them are 18 and above, they're all legally women, none of them will be counted. So if Daddy Free's family of 6 people went to listen to Yahushua preach, all we will have is Daddy Free's 1 person. So how do we accurately know the number of people Christ fed when only the men were counted? So this brings us back to the Joe Rogan paradigm, or the context. I say paradigm, paradox, and this particular paradox eliminates what many of us would have called a proper peer review or thought context, where things are properly thought about. Are you ready? Yes. All right, let's go. So, if you do your research, you will find out that indeed Adonai and his Asherah were part of the earliest scripts. How was Asherah removed? Well, some people blame Josiah for trying to maintain a balance where men were favored. So many other things were factors. But if you were to ask me, I will give you my 3 conclusions. The first one is the God's finger paradox. We can't understand anything more than a fingerprint of God, so we just try to label God and explain God in our dimension, despite the fact that he doesn't live in our dimension. The second one, we don't understand time, time dilation, and the way time works, because in the 3rd dimension, time is linear. Your 5 o'clock will come before 5:30, which will come before 5:45, which will come before 6 o'clock. So if you were to have time go from 5 o'clock to 3 a.m. and then go back to 4 a.m. and then go to 11 p.m., it becomes non-linear. And you can't understand it because non-linear time doesn't exist in the 3rd dimension. So how do you explain a non-linear God, non-linear time God in our dimension? So that's the time paradox. And fourthly, the context. Who told you the story? Joe Rogan came and told us a story, and everybody believed it until we heard the second part of the story. But are you ever listening to the second part of the story? And when I was talking to Simply Vic about this, Simply Vic was like, you were bold to talk about Lucifer. You were bold to talk about tithing. I'm like, tithing is easy. It's in there in the Bible. The Bible, just to prove tithing, you don't need to go out of the Bible. It's right. You will use the Bible from beginning to the end. The English Bible. It's fine. Lucifer, on the other hand, you have to go to the Textus Receptus, or the critical text, or the majority text, or any Greek translation. And then you also have to go to the Biblia Sacra Vulgata, that is the Latin Vulgate, to get the word Lucifer. So for the word Lucifer, you have to do a bit more work than just the Bible. Well, it is still the Bible, but you have to leave English and go to Latin and Greek. But you see, when it comes to something like Asherah, it's not Greek Bible, it's not English Bible, it's not Latin Bible. It's history of the Israelites, history of Canaan, history of Palestine and the environs, and the discoveries that were the archaeological discoveries that point scholars almost unanimously to the evidence of Asherah as being God's wife were only discovered in the 1960s and the 1970s. Remember, the King James Bible, which is the Bible, as far as I'm concerned, is the most useless of all Bibles, the worst translation ever. But that's the translation the church leans upon. And the King James Bible does not even take the Dead Sea Scrolls into consideration, let alone other archaeological findings. So how do you go past the Joe Rogan paradox when you are not ready to accept new information? When you're not ready to accept proper scientific peer reviewing from scholars? So I'm leaving you with this thought. The biggest problem you have with religion is that the people who taught it to you could not get past certain biases and could not accommodate certain paradoxes. And as long as you do not accommodate the paradoxes and get past your biases, you're only going to end up playing with ambiguity. Pentecostal Christianity is a play park of ambiguity. And that is why there is no evidence of its usefulness, its spirituality, or its success. Because you have 10 churches on every street and you cannot point to one thing Nigerians have that our counterparts abroad in other countries where Christianity is not a dominant force. You cannot point to one thing we have that they don't. As I'm speaking to you today, Wales and England are no longer predominantly Christian countries. And they are not doing worse than we are. With all our praying, fasting, speaking in tongues, and church. Of what use is, okay, Daddy Freeze, I believe you, God had a wife. Of what use is it to me? It will help in the narrative of understanding that the woman is not your servant. Yes, you are the figurehead, which means the two of you take decisions or make decisions. You are the one who stands for the decision. The president of a country doesn't make so many decisions. It is a council that sits down and makes the decisions, and he approves the decisions. So if you understand that, VNAS comes here and types, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you don't have sense, because you wouldn't come here, read the heading, and still type like this. How did you... I'm sorry, I don't want you to listen to me. You are too slow you can't catch up. I'm angry that I'm teaching this 7 years later, and Vic is still angry with me that I've not taught it till now, and then I'm teaching it and somebody's asking me. I can't deal. Please, F off. I don't have the patience to handle someone like you. I'm sorry, I can't cope. So I want to end here. Do your research. And when you tell a Christian to do research, he goes to pastor that is dumber than him to ask him to explain things that the pastor does not understand. And even if the pastor understands, the pastor will try to protect you from the information, because if you have access to certain information, you will not be able to be manipulated according to the way the dogma is created to manipulate. I don't know if you can make it. V says, I genuinely didn't know what your topic was. I'm sorry, I have very little patience, and the topic is right there, up there. Okay, I'm sorry, I apologize. It's a very stressful topic to teach, so it's frustrating. Venus, forgive me, the topic is right there. So, do your research. Follow proper scholarly work, and you will come back and thank me later. I don't look at my wife as my tool or my servant. I look at her as my equal. Even though she allows me to take decisions, I know taking decisions is a responsibility, and there are some times when I allow her to take the decisions just to remove me from the responsibility, because sometimes the responsibility can be overwhelming. And we know, as scholars, that Asherah was a partner of Adonai. And we know that what our parents taught us and what they knew is very flawed. So we cannot use it as a corrective tool. It is like, let me give you an example. There was a time and motion inspector who came to a factory. The time and motion inspector is somebody who says, okay, at 8 o'clock you have meeting. He wants to make sure that 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock is the meeting. 9 o'clock you go to the lab. In the lab you produce for 2 hours. 11 o'clock you do this. Then at 1 o'clock you go for a break. Then you come back from your break at 2 o'clock. So he wants to make sure that there's time and motion is properly coordinated. At 1 you go for your break and you are back from your break at 2. So they're called time and motion inspectors. So at 1 o'clock, he noticed that the clock was 5 minutes to 1. But at that 5 minutes to 1, on his time was 5 minutes to 1, but the clock said 1 o'clock. And a bell rang, and as soon as the bell rang, a GUN was fired next door. So he asked them, said, have you ever set this clock before? They said, nah, that the clock is accurate. That anytime we ring our bell, you notice that around that same time, the factory next door fires their GUN. So he went to the factory next door and said, hi guys, how do you know your clock is right? They said, our clock is right too. That exactly at 2 o'clock, you hear these people ring their bell, and we too will fire our GUN. So, how do you peer review when both are wrong and both are relying on one another to convince themselves that they are right? When what your parents taught you about Christianity, that's one of the things you must get from the Free Nation. First, you are not paying tithe. It's a scam, a fraud, anything you like to call it. That's what tithe is. Number 2, the devil is not Lucifer. Lucifer was only used in the New Testament to reference Christ. Lucifer is a Latin word, is found in the Latin Vulgate, and in 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 19, it was clearly talking about Christ. No debate, no argument. Just those 2 principles have brought to the knees all your parents taught you. All they knew has been brought to question. So you cannot cross-check the questions if you are using them as the answer. You'll be doing wuru-wuru to the answer. You have to go outside and get an external audit of your beliefs. So, I just wanted to tell you that real quick. God bless you. I love you. I look forward to seeing you guys soon. Take care. Church tomorrow, 1 p.m. Don't be late.